Good evening and welcome to the public lecture series of Contagion. Contagion is the fourth exhibition organized by Science Gallery Bengaluru. Science Gallery Bengaluru is a part of an international network of galleries, and we are a public institution for research-based engagement. In Contagion, we are trying to explore the phenomenon of transmission, not only of diseases, but also of ideas, emotions, and behaviors. Today's lecture is a part of our public lecture series supported by the Indian National Science Academy. And today's speaker is Thomas Abraham. His lecture is entitled An Early Warning, the Story of SARS in 2003. Before I introduce Thomas Abraham, allow me to mention our upcoming programs. We have Human Rights and Knowledge During Crises, a panel discussion with Sanjoy Bhattacharya, who's an academic advisor to this exhibition season, together with Seye Abimbola and Sharifa Sekalala on Friday, 11 June at 2 p.m. Matter Out of Place, a masterclass with the artist Basis Tidgen from Germany on Friday, 11 June at 4 p.m. Listening with Ears, a masterclass by Avichal Mahajan, which in a way explores the phenomenon of infodemics. This is on Sunday, 13 June at 12:30 p.m. IST. Remember, next week is our last week of intensive programming, following which this phase of Contagion comes to an end and another phase will begin. Watch out for more on that in the upcoming week. Thomas Abraham is Adjunct Associate Professor at the University of Hong Kong and a writer on health and disease. He is the author of the much acclaimed 21st Century Plague, The Story of SARS and Polio, The Odyssey of Eradication. He has earlier been an advisor to the World Health Organization. Remember, you can type in your questions in the Q&A box as we move along in the lecture, and do, of course, not forget to give us your feedback, because that's what will help us ensure that we are able to deliver in ways that are relevant and meaningful to you. Thank you very much, and over to you, Thomas.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and just give me a minute while I screen up. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Okay, if I don't hear from you, I assume all of you can.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
All right, terrific. So thank you so much for the introduction, also for this invitation to speak, to be part of this wonderful series that you have organized. We are all living in the midst of this unprecedented COVID pandemic. But we should really have been warned, because things like this have happened. From the same family of viruses, we had SARS, which I'm going to talk to you about, from other viruses. This is something that has happened throughout human history, and yet each time it happens, we are taken completely by surprise. And so I'd like to really take you through what happened in 2003 when we had SARS, the grandfather, or the great-great-great-grandfather, if you will, of COVID-19. I'd like to begin, take a look at this photograph. It's a really cute picture. It's this young couple. Well, obviously there's a disease going around, so this couple is masked, but they clearly are not going to let any virus stand in their way, and they're going ahead to get married. But besides being a really cute picture, what's interesting about this was, this, by the way, was taken in Wuhan, right? The town or the city in central China that we are all familiar with. But this was not taken either this year or last year. This was actually taken in 2003 during the SARS epidemic. And it really gives you an idea of, this has happened before. COVID-19 took us by surprise, but we really had plenty of warning. And I'm going to go very briefly through some of these warning signals, because I know there have been other lectures and lecturers in this series who've gone through this in some detail. So we've had general warnings in the form of the emergence of new disease. At least 20 new infectious diseases have emerged since the 1970s. Probably the most prominent is HIV/AIDS and maybe SARS, but we're familiar with Ebola, Nipah, which we had outbreaks in Kerala and in West Bengal. Marburg, which we're probably less familiar with, but once more, this is a viral disease that emerged in Central Africa. So this has happened before. And all of these have been caused by viruses which have passed from animals to humans. We've also had specific warnings about the potential danger that coronaviruses can pose. 2002, 2003, SARS broke out in China, spread to Hong Kong, Singapore, Vietnam, Canada, and it crippled some of the most dynamic cities in the world. It was really a forerunner of what we are seeing today when the entire global economy has been shut down. 2014, we had MERS, or Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which we are probably a little less familiar with, but this was also caused by a new coronavirus. It emerged in the Middle East. It caused disease across the region and one big outbreak in South Korea. And MERS is still circulating in the Middle East, but it really hasn't sort of exploded in the way either that SARS did or, of course, in the way that COVID-19. But these were all little signs that nature has been throwing in our way. So let's look at the story of SARS. One way to begin the story is on the 16th of November 2002, and the place is the town of Foshan in the province of Guangdong. Guangdong is one of the southern provinces of China. It's one of the economic powerhouses of China. It abuts Hong Kong and Macau. And of course, all of this is the South China Sea. So in this little town, November 16th, a 46-year-old government employee was admitted to hospital. He had this pneumonia-like illness, and he spread it to 5 of his family members, but they all survived, and it did not spread any further. He also had no contact with wild animals or animal markers, and we'll come back to this later. And this case it was only through tracing back that this one case was found in November 2002. But they might have been earlier ones, but this was the first recorded case of what later became to be known as SARS. A month later, in the city of Haiwan, which is here, so Foshan was here, suddenly you get a cluster here. It's a couple of 100 kilometers away. And this time it is a 36-year-old cook. He's called Huang Xingchu. And he had high fever. His lungs were congested. He could barely breathe. And this was a cook who had been working with wildlife and seafood as well. And what was unusual was this was not normal pneumonia. It did not respond to antibiotics. And he was young. He was much younger than the normal age of people who get severe pneumonia. So he was transferred to a bigger hospital in Guangzhou over here. That is the provincial capital. He was kept alive on a ventilator, and he eventually recovered. However, he infected 7 medical workers during his hospital stay. So once more, you get an inkling of what is building up. By late December 2002, you have a patient with similar symptoms turning up at a hospital in Zhongshan, which is down here, about 200 kilometers south of Haiwan. And there too, the disease spread to doctors and health workers, causing alarm. And it was here really that people started to get really worried, because more and more doctors were falling sick, nurses as well. And they were telling their families, their friends, that we don't know how to deal with this. This is really serious. And we're getting sick as well. And so people flocked to medical stores to buy both traditional Chinese medicines as well as antibiotics and anything they could think of. Now, by January 2003, cases were popping up all over the province, including in the provincial capital. So I haven't marked all the places, but basically you're getting these little red spots sort of popping up everywhere. And by now, doctors and health workers, nurses, public health people, the government and the public were really alarmed. So why were these cases alarming? This was winter, mind you, so cases of pneumonia in winter are not that unusual. But these cases were different because younger people were falling ill. So let's look back at the ages of the people. So people in their 30s and 40s are the ones that we've been seeing who've been falling ill. And this is unusual. I mean, if these had been people in their 60s and 70s, I don't think anyone would have paid any attention, and it would have taken a lot longer for SARS to be recognized for what it was. Patients were not recovering from, were not responding to antibiotics, so it was not a bacterial pneumonia. Therefore, it was probably viral in origin. But from patient samples, doctors, or at least scientists and laboratory people, could not find any of the known viruses that were known to cause viral pneumonia. Also, the extent of lung damage was really, really severe, and people who looked at the x-rays of somebody, of these patients, were really surprised, both at the extent of damage and at the speed with which the virus was really destroying lungs. And finally was the fact that this disease was highly infectious. It was spreading in hospitals and hitting doctors, nurses, attendants, healthcare workers. And these are people who are used to dealing with pneumonia every winter without falling ill. Now here you've got this really strange disease. It's hitting young people and it's hitting healthcare workers. It's causing severe, severe damage. So the central government in Beijing and the provincial government in Guangzhou, Guangdong province rather, got alarmed, and so they put together this team of a joint team of experts from the central government as well as the provincial government. And this team traveled to Heiwan and Foshan, as well as some of the other centers, to investigate and find out what's going on. They actually did a remarkable job because they produced the first detailed description of this new disease, as well as a range of treatment options. They called the disease atypical pneumonia, since it was neither bacterial or neither was it caused by any of the viruses that they were familiar with. And so they said this is probably caused by a virus that we haven't seen before. And based on the pattern of infection, they felt it was spread through respiratory droplets. And so they emphasized in the treatment in hospitals, they said it's really, really good, important to have good ventilation, really good infection control among hospital workers. And the treatment that they recommended was steroid treatment, steroids, which we're still using for COVID-19 today. And why? Because basically to protect the lungs from severe damage. And so they recommended steroids. And so this was an early description of the disease and an excellent description of the disease. Now here's the scandal. Here's what I call the Great CoverUp. Now this expert report was handed to the provincial government, which passed it on to all the major hospitals in the province. But at the same time, the government clamped down on media reporting of these cases. And news organizations were asked not to cover the disease to avoid public fear and instability. And later directives from the provincial government were even more strict. They said you cannot send reporters to interview doctors, you cannot talk to patients, you cannot report on people buying medicines, food, nothing. And finally, they said, all you can do is publish official press releases. So as and when we give a press release, you publish it. Till then, don't publish a thing. And how did the media respond to this? And this is interesting really to note because for those who are not familiar with China, the picture is of this sort of really, really authoritarian, one-party communist state where everybody says the same thing, does the same thing, walks at the same speed, and so on and so forth. But that is not the case. It's actually a very, very diverse society, a dynamic society, and very much like India, with differences of opinion, different kinds of people. And also, though the media in China is under the control of the state, Guangdong province, which is economically very dynamic, also has home to some of the more adventurous media groups and with really good professional journalists who tried to push the boundaries. So here's what they did. Since they were not allowed to report what was going on as fact, they reported the facts, but they described them as rumors. For example, they would write, there is a rumor of an epidemic spreading in Guangzhou. It is rumored that the symptoms include fever and patches on the lung. I'm sorry, there's a typo in there. The authorities promptly clamped down on this as well. So why the secrecy? And here I must note that, this is not something unique to China. Governments all over the world try and do this. The provincial government wanted to give the impression that all was well and that it was managing the disease. There may have been some small disease, but now it's all gone away. As I had mentioned earlier, Guangdong is one of the economic powerhouses of China, and the provincial leadership did not want economic activity to go down or foreign investment to slow down. And so they were very resistant to any idea that they might have to shut down factories or shut down schools or do anything that would affect the provincial GDP figures. At the same time, the central government was going through a major leadership change. This was actually a generational change of leadership, which happens every 5-10 years. And the biggest concern of the party and government was to have a stable atmosphere during this transition. So they didn't want any distractions about diseases, people panicking, or any of that. They wanted stability. And so for all of these reasons, this was a pandemic or an epidemic at that point of time that proceeded in secrecy. But despite this, medical experts and health workers and doctors responded heroically. Now this is Zhong Nanshan. He is still very, very active. He must be 89 years old now. And this is a recent photograph of him. When SARS erupted, he was in his late 60s. He was a top respiratory diseases expert. And he produced the first detailed case definition as well as treatment protocols. Now, case definitions, when a disease emerges or when a new disease emerges, case definitions are all important, and especially for a disease where the symptoms are so similar to, pneumonia or flu, because when a patient turns up at a hospital or in front of a doctor, the doctor needs to be able to distinguish between a case of flu and this new disease. And that is where the case definition is all important. And so it was the doctors in Guangdong who wrote down the first definition of what this disease really was and how it was different, how you could distinguish it from other similar respiratory diseases. He also publicly contradicted the government on several occasions and said the disease was not under control. So here you had the government saying everything is under control. He said it's not under control. And he asked, how can you bring a disease under control when you do not even know what is causing it? Because at this point of time, all they knew was that it was a new virus, but they didn't know what kind of virus it was. They had not isolated the virus. They knew very little about it. He could get away with it also because he was a very, very well-respected scientist. He was a member of the Chinese National Academy of Science, which is a very high-powered body. And he basically was somebody that nobody could touch. And he used his position really to speak his mind, which is really admirable. And later, once it was all over, he was hailed as one of the heroes of SARS and so on and so forth. And he, as I had mentioned earlier, he's still active in the COVID-19 response. But the real tragedy of SARS is the tragedy that was caused by secrecy. So as I had said earlier, medical experts had figured out a lot about the disease, symptoms, the disease progression, treatment, the precautions that need to be taken, and so on and so forth. But because of secrecy, this was never shared. So when the disease spread out of Guangdong to Hong Kong first and then to the rest of the world, doctors had to work this out afresh. And even within China, when cases first traveled from Guangdong and popped up in Beijing and other cities, doctors were taken by surprise because they had been told that, well, this was just a small outbreak of respiratory pneumonia and it's over now. So when you had patients turning up with the severe disease in other parts of China, they were taken by surprise as well. And it is this culture of secrecy that led to this huge loss of lives and allowed the disease to spread globally. And this, I think, this is basically really criminal negligence. So the world learned about this disease only when cases appeared in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is a global city, and it is still, despite what has happened over the last year or so, still a very open city where people come, go, you've got the international media, people talk a lot, the doctors are open, people know what's happening. And so when the disease appeared in Hong Kong, suddenly the whole world stood up and took notice. So case numbers, clinical data, virological data were shared globally through networks that the WHO had set up once data became available through cases in Hong Kong. It was in Hong Kong that the virus causing the disease was identified as a previously unknown coronavirus by scientists at the University of Hong Kong. And it was also from Hong Kong that SARS spread to other countries. So this is the Metropole Hotel in Hong Kong. And there is also an exhibit on this hotel and what happened in this hotel as part of the same contagion exhibition. So some of you may have gone through that and be familiar with it, but let me take you through what happened there. An infected doctor from Guangzhou and his wife checked into the 9th floor of this hotel on February 22nd, 2003, the night of February 22nd, to attend a family wedding. Now, this was a doctor who had been treating patients with this atypical pneumonia. And so he knew about the disease, but he was feeling fine. And so he got onto this bus with his wife and came down to Hong Kong to attend this wedding. The day he arrived in the afternoon, he was well enough still. I think he and the family went shopping, came back to the hotel. He wasn't feeling that great. He slept. And by the next morning, he felt terrible. So he walked down the road, and fortunately about 500 meters down the road, less than 500 meters down the road, from the Metropole Hotel is one of the big public hospitals in Hong Kong called the Kwong-Wah Hospital. So he went in there, went to the emergency room and told them, this is what I'm having, this is who I am, I've been treating patients like this, so please, this is very, very contagious, so please admit me and put me into an isolation ward. And a day later, one of his colleagues from Guangzhou, who had heard that he was ill, came down and spoke to the doctors at this hospital again and told them, be very, very careful. This is a highly infectious disease. We have no idea what it is, but all we know is it spreads rapidly. It affects healthcare workers and doctors. So whatever you do, please, mask yourself, double mask yourself, and be very, very careful. So this really, and the doctor was the first. He actually was not the first known case. There were earlier cases which were retrospectively identified, but he was the first notable case who sparked a super spreader event. But at the same time, he provided the best warning that Hong Kong had and the best information that Hong Kong had till date about what this disease was about. So a few rooms away from the doctor was another elderly Chinese-Canadian couple. They had come to visit their sons and were spending the last night of their stay in Hong Kong in the hotel before flying to Toronto. And it's important to note that this outbreak happened during the period of Chinese New Year, and February 22nd was about a month after Chinese New Year. So Chinese New Year is a time when a lot of overseas Chinese come home to spend time with family and so on, and this had happened here as well, including in Hong Kong. So opposite the doctor's room, there was a businessman who was on his way to Vietnam to visit his company's textile factory. He was a Chinese-American businessman, and he had gone to Shanghai at first, and he was flying from Shanghai to Hong Kong, to Vietnam, to his factories, and he decided to he spent one night in Hong Kong before catching his onward flight. At the end of the same corridor on the 9th floor was a 23-year-old former air hostess, airline stewardess from Singapore. And she had come with a friend for a few days of shopping. And this was really the last day before she flew back home. On the same floor was another 72-year-old Chinese Canadian who had come visiting friends in Hong Kong. There was another guest who took the disease to Ireland. None of these people ever met, but they all got infected and carried the disease to Singapore, Vietnam, Canada, and elsewhere. So this was an amazing super spreader event. And nobody really knows how this happened because none of them ever went. And later teams of epidemiologists and teams of multidisciplinary scientists, including physicists who specialized in airflow dynamics and so on and so forth, came and visited this hotel to try and find out what had actually happened, because none of them ever met, none of them ever shared a lift together. And all they could find was a lot of traces of virus on the carpet outside the doctor's room. So one hypothesis was that the doctor was sick, that he vomited, and that he and his wife sort of cleaned it up, but there was a lot of virus still left over. But his wife, who also fell ill but recovered, she says, no, this didn't happen. So one of the many mysteries of SARS. So here's a graphic which explains what happened in the Metropole Hotel. And totally there were about 413 cases globally that can be traced back to guests at the Metropole Hotel. I hasten to add, I mean, clearly the Metropole Hotel, which by the way has been renamed as the Metro Park Hotel, was an important, I mean, it was an important location where all of this happened. But this does not mean that the disease would not have spread. Even if this group of people had not turned up at the Metropole Hotel, it would still have spread globally, right? But it was just this one event that happened to concentrate all of these people and sort of cause an almost simultaneous explosion of disease. Now, as far as SARS was concerned, the world was fortunate. And almost by a miracle, by June of 2003, the disease had disappeared, after causing 8,098 cases globally and 774 deaths. Now, if you compare, I mean, the number of cases is so small, and this is less than the daily caseload of many countries, including India today. But I want you to look at the death figures. And if you look at it, I mean, the percentage of deaths is really high. It's between 9 and 10%, which is really, really severe. Now, in the case of COVID-19, it's basically 1, 2, maybe 3% of those who are infected die. But here you see that it was a very, very high percentage of people who were dying. Why did it disappear? Nobody knows. But one reason, and one thing we do know, is that it transmitted between humans less easily than SARS-CoV-2. Virologically, the original SARS virus, it was a little clumsier in the way that it attached to human cells and the way that it managed to infect cells. The SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is causing COVID-19, is a lot more efficient at this. Also, one important fact, I think, was that it was easier to detect and stop chains of transmission. SARS patients only became infectious after they developed symptoms. So, for example, I would be infected by somebody, the virus would incubate, grow within me, and within a week or so, it would start infecting more and more of my cells, and then I would start feeling symptoms. I'd start feeling terrible, fever, cough, and so on. Now, with SARS, I could only pass this on, or I would only pass this on to other people after I developed symptoms. So it was only after I started feeling terrible and coughing that I began to transmit to others. And so this made it relatively easy to detect. It spread a lot slower because once you start feeling very sick, you tend to stay at home. You don't wander around spreading it to others. Now, the thing with COVID-19 is that those who are infected can infect others 3-4 days before they themselves develop symptoms. And also you have a large number of patients who get, people who get infected, who the virus multiplies a little within them, they pass it on to others, but they themselves do not display any symptoms. So you can see yourself how much easier COVID-19 transmits, how it spreads so much more quickly than did SARS. Where did this new virus come from? Now, I want you to look at this photograph. So this is a photograph of an animal market in China. Animal markets are often confused with wet markets. So wet markets is just any market where anything other than, dry rations, if you will, where rice and so on is sold. But a wet market is a place where vegetables and fish and chicken and so on is sold. And wet markets are common everywhere. But here, what we should really concentrate on are live animal markets. Now, people in China have a much more varied intake of animal proteins than people in many other parts of the world, right? So in addition to the normal chicken, fish, pork, and beef, people in China also eat a variety of other animal proteins. And why do they do it? Because culturally they've done this for a long time. One theory is that during famines in China, including the famines that Mao caused during his Great Leap Forward, people learned to eat whatever they was, right? And also in traditional Chinese medicine and Chinese culture, there's a feeling that different kinds of meat, especially if eaten fresh, will give you different qualities, right? So you eat, you eat, for example, this here is frog meat. So these are live frogs here. And these are the frogs that have been cut and prepared for selling. And the big thing is that this has to be eaten fresh. I mean, there's no point, frozen stuff is useless, right? As far as Chinese cuisine is concerned, it has to be fresh. It's only then that you get the full quality of whatever animal you are eating. So I don't know why people eat frogs. Maybe makes you feel lively. Some foods are thought, some meats are supposed to be very heaty and really good to eat in winter, and so on and so forth, right? So animal markets are big in Chinese culture. Now this was actually taken some years ago. The one I showed you before was very recent, but this is a much, much older photograph. And the animals you see in the cage here are palm civets or civet cats. They're banned now from being sold or farmed or eaten in China because of the SARS experience. But in 2003, they were eaten. They were prized as a winter food because they were supposed to be a warming. The meat of this animal was supposed to be something, you make a soup of it. It was supposed to warm you and keep you warm in winter and so on. So where did this come from? During SARS itself, I'm sure, a study in animal markets in May 2003, sorry, this is not 2002, it should be 2003, found, and these were animal markets in around Guangzhou, some of the places where SARS had broken out. They found that palm civets, that's the animal that we looked at just before, carried a coronavirus that was 99.8% genetically similar to the SARS coronavirus. Not identical, but it's very, very similar. They also found that 40% of traders in this market had antibodies to this civet cat coronavirus, though none of them had any disease. So they had clearly been exposed to this, and clearly you had viruses very similar to the SARS virus that had been jumping like a ping pong ball, jumping back and forth between animals and traders in these markets, and it's within the animals in the market as well. So it was not just civets, but there were raccoons, a whole variety of other animals as well that had very similar coronaviruses in them. And what this indicated was that a SARS-like coronavirus had been transmitting in animal markets in Guangdong province and circulating and jumping between animals and humans, and was probably the closest the progenitor of the SARS virus. And this is a pattern that we see even today. I think some of you would have read the news reports of tigers in zoos in Chennai and in other cities as well that have been detected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the virus that has caused COVID-19. And this is clearly something that would have passed from the humans who were looking after these tigers to the animals themselves. We had a case in Denmark of minks being farmed. Now minks, which are farmed for their fur, which are turned into mink coats, are commercially farmed in Denmark. And last year, the Danish public health authorities found a variety of SARS-CoV-2 that had been transmitting between minks and between minks and humans. And as far as COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2 is concerned, the samples from the Wuhan market showed viruses present. The Wuhan animal market showed viruses present that were very, very similar to the virus that started circulating in humans. So clearly, these are known as zoonotic diseases, diseases that move from animal to man, right? But there's also a lot of back and forth, and this is how viruses also change. They move from animal to man, back to another animal, back to human beings, back to 2-3 other animals, back to human beings. And in this process, they can acquire the mutations that are required to create a virus that multiplies well in human beings and that is able to transmit easily from one human to another. We have seen this process happening over human history. Of course, the big question is, how did these animals catch the virus? Now, in 2005, that is two years after all of this, I mean, one hypothesis always had been that bats are a major source, natural reservoir of the coronavirus. There'd always been the suspicion that this had passed from bats to various intermediary animals and then to human beings. So various expeditions started to try and isolate viruses, coronaviruses in bats, in their natural habitat, in caves all over the country that were close to the SARS virus. And in 2005, a team of researchers from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, in Wuhan, which is one of the leading institutes of virology in Wuhan, along with a group of international researchers, isolated a virus from bats in Yunnan province in southwest China that was very similar to the SARS virus. And so the hypothesis is that that virus either circulated some more in bats, but we haven't got the full chain, or moved from bats to humans and did this ping pong thing until it emerged as a virus that could cause disease in humans and transmit between humans. Let's keep an eye on it. So what are the lessons that we learned and also did not learn? Lessons that were learned. 2003, China was exposed globally for trying to cover up this virus. And this was a huge blow. For the last 2 decades, I mean, the Chinese leadership has been really focused on China, developing China's economy until it becomes the largest economy in the world and emerging as a leading global power and a responsible leading global power. Now, economically, it has succeeded. Right now, it is the second largest economy in the world, and it is a global power. But both COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2 have really damaged its reputation. And the desire both of the Chinese leadership and of people in China really to be treated, as responsible citizens of a responsible global power. The Chinese leadership seems to have learned its lessons. So in the case of COVID-19, initially there was a lack of information, but it's important to note that the virus was identified by Chinese scientists in record time. Its genetic sequence was posted globally in early January. So the earliest cases were probably sometime in December. And they started off very similar with small cases of 1 or 2 people with this strange pneumonia. And then by mid-December, you actually had clusters of cases. And that's when people started getting worried. The virus was isolated by early January, and the sequence was posted. That's all within a month, 6 weeks maximum of the first cases emerging. And I want you to compare this with the November, December, January, February 4-month gap between the emergence of SARS in late 2002 and the world getting some information about this in February 2003. And this time, one of the big things that has happened is that the sequencing of the virus, the posting of this globally, posting the genetic sequence of the virus on databases, global databases. This allowed diagnostics to be created within the first 10 days of January, before there were cases globally. And there were a few cases in countries surrounding China, but it had not really spread globally. But you had labs across the world that had developed tools to diagnosis, genetic tools, RT-PCR kits. Also, it allowed labs all over the world to begin working on a vaccine. And it was the work that began on vaccines in January, once the genetic sequence of the new virus had been posted. We are seeing the fruits of that work right now in the speed with which vaccines have been rolled out. I think I've said this already. I mean, you look at this in contrast. So what were the global lessons? So after SARS in 2003, the WHO's international health regulations were updated to make it mandatory for countries to report diseases that had a potential to spread internationally. And this was not the case earlier. The WHO also was given wider powers to ask countries for information. They didn't have to wait until the country provided information. They could approach a country saying, hey, we have heard this is going on. Please give us more information or tell us what is actually going on. Procedures were also laid down for the WHO to declare a public health emergency of international concern, or FAKE as it is called, and make recommendations to countries on the actions they should take. So all these sort of the template for action was laid down. And it was this template that was followed when COVID-19 emerged. We can argue, and I think arguably the way that this template was followed was not perfect. There were huge mistakes all along the way, but people knew what to do. The global system knew what to do as soon as you had a new virus that was spreading. And that was not the case in 2003. So these are some of the lessons that were learned. But how well were these lessons learned? Now, some countries, and these are countries that experienced SARS earlier, China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Vietnam, East Asia in general, did much better in controlling COVID-19 than countries that had not experienced SARS. Whether it was the UK, whether it was the US, Europe, Australia, India, most countries that had not experienced this, they were watching this when the virus started exploding in Wuhan. You had the lockdown in Wuhan, you had these hospitals being built, and all of this is in January. Everybody could see this was highly, highly transmissible. It was spreading like wildfire. But most countries basically looked at it as if this was a movie happening somewhere else, right? They looked at it as a theater. They said, wow, see what's happening in China. It was not enough preparation. In fact, the preparation was woefully inadequate in terms of thinking, what happens if this reaches here? What are the things that we need to do? Are we prepared to do what China's doing now? Nobody did, except those countries that had faced SARS before. These countries were also meticulous in executing the basis of disease containment, which is not rocket science. It does not require great technology. What do you need to do? You need to identify cases through testing, so you need testing kits. You need to isolate cases. You need to trace the contacts of these cases, and quarantine them. So you need to find sick people. You need to find everybody whom these sick people have been in contact with. You need to isolate them to make sure they don't spread the disease any further. And that basically is all that you needed to do. And obviously, this is a lot harder to do. It requires a great deal of organization, but it is not rocket science. And of course, you need to do things like ensure people are masked, ban all mass gatherings, ensure hand hygiene, all of which reduce the opportunity for the virus to transmit from one person to the other. And in the gap between the emergence of these early cases in China and elsewhere and the development of vaccines at the end of last year, these measures would actually have done a lot. And these measures are all the lessons that were learned from SARS, would have done a lot to contain the disease globally. An expert panel appointed by the WHO recently, and they published a report about a month ago, they found many things, but this is basically the sum and substance of what they said. The world was not prepared and ignored warnings, which resulted in a massive failure. An outbreak of a new virus in Wuhan was allowed to become a global pandemic, and this was preventable. I mean, there's a big, big gap between a virus emerging in a city, one city in China, and spreading to every country in the world. Okay? There's many, many things needed to happen in between, and all of these things were allowed to happen. So I'm going to wind up really quickly. And so what does the future hold for us? Now, one thing we can be sure of is that new viruses will continue to emerge from the animal world. They will pass on to humans. They will cause disease. This has happened through the history of the human species. It will continue to happen. Many of them, of these sort of viruses that pass from animal to man or from other species of animals to human beings who are also a species of animals, will not transmit extensively. They will die down. But once in a while, we will experience devastating pandemics like the flu pandemic of 1918 and COVID-19. So the question really is, and this is not just a question, this really is a task before all of us. And this is not a task for governments, this is a task for all of us who have lived through COVID-19 and want to make sure that our children's and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren's generations are spared similar events. And this is not something that just governments will do or scientists do. It's something that all of us who have lived through this must ensure. It is all our task. So with that, let me stop and hand it back to Jahnavi.
Thank you very much, Thomas. This was fabulous, and I think for those of us who have worked at the back end of the exhibition, this was like reliving a story which we have learned to kind of think about with some degree of trepidation. So what I'm going to do before we move on to the questions, and so please start typing your questions into the Q&A box. I'm going to invite my colleague Madhu to share with us Blast Theory's exhibit, which is in the exhibition, and it's called A Cluster of 17 Cases. And you'll realize what I'm saying as soon as you see it. So Madhu, quickly perhaps, go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Thomas. It was a wonderful session. And I think just like Jahnavi said, we felt like we really got the on-ground sort of understanding. And I think cluster of 17 cases, as you have seen as well, and is an exhibit that kind of tries to take you back to that point of time. So for those who haven't seen this yet, this is a piece that's available to be seen at the exhibition only until the 13th of June. So I would advise everyone to check it out immediately. It's by artist group Blast Theory. So Blast Theory is an interdisciplinary group of artists, and they had the privilege of being the first group of artists to be in residence at the WHO in the shock room. So that's the Strategic Health Operations Center. And if you, of course, explore our exhibits page, you'll know there are different sections. So you can see about the artwork, the team, which is Blast Theory, and the process. And this very interesting object that we see here is what Blast Theory built during their residency at the WHO. And this is a scale model of the Metropole Hotel in Hong Kong, where this outbreak happened. And Blast Theory actually went several times to Hong Kong to study the hotel, to measure it, to understand, and to be able to create this model. And this physical model has been shown in several exhibitions from 2018 to 2020. And what is really cool is what Blast Theory has built for Contagion for our digital exhibition, which is a digital experience of this outbreak. So what you can see here is that they've shot a film within the scale model, right? So imagine a miniature camera going in and capturing it as if you were walking through the scale model. And they've used this to create, therefore, an experience like Bandersnatch, which many of you might have seen, which is an interactive participatory walkthrough of this hotel. And what you get to do is choose your room. So if you think about this very, from in a very distant way, we all stay in hotel rooms. We all make a choice of which room we'd like to sleep in at that night. We walk through the corridor, we press the button on the lift, and we never think about what unexpected consequences might be to the most banal of actions, right? And that was the case for the 17 guests who stayed in the hotel that night. And as you get into a cluster of 17 cases, it takes you to Hong Kong, to the night of the 21st of February, 2003, to the Metropole Hotel. And you get to walk in the footsteps of those guests who stayed there that night. What is really amazing about this piece is that you could change the story. You can come back each time you play it. You could walk through a different narrative, choose a different room. Some people will, as you know, pick up SARS-CoV this night. Some people won't. What is it that differentiates them? What did they do differently in the hotel that night that caused this? As Thomas spoke about, it's airborne. A lot of their understanding came from epidemiologists coming in and studying who picked it up, in which room. They also did something very interesting called smoke test, which if you play the experience through, you'll get to see how they release smoke to understand how air currents were moving, how ventilation, which again, like Thomas said, is so important and became such a crucial issue, affects these things. So I would, of course, this is just a preview. From here onwards, I would ask you to I'm sure the team will share the link in the chat. Definitely watch it, play it, experience it. It's an extremely eerie, yet a sort of nerve-wracking experience to be in in the eye of the storm where things were starting out before people knew it was starting out, right? And you can choose different rooms, explore it, go through it. And of course, I think young people who are there in today's tutorial session with Thomas will also get a very different view on this exhibit, because we were really lucky to actually have Thomas come in and sit in with one of the sessions with Matt Adams, right? So this is the kind of cool things that can happen. So yeah.
In fact, I would like everyone who signed up for the tutorial to actually go over it in the little time we have between the end of the lecture. Sorry, Mantashi, over to you. Back to you.
No, and I just the last thing I'd like to say is for those who are interested, there are many, many more resources at the end of the exhibit. So don't miss those out as well, because whether they're things to read, things to listen, things to watch, given the amount of things that are going on, we're hearing a lot about SARS nowadays. So please feel free to continue to dive deep and, find out more. And hopefully it will help answering questions that you might have.
Thank you, Madhu. Thank you. Yeah, quickly. So there are a few of our friends in the audience. John, do you have a question? I'm putting you on the spot here, but I'm sure you have something to say. Okay, before John makes up, has he already said something? Yes. Oh, wonderful. Please, could we is it possible maybe for John to ask the question live? What is the team? Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, guys. Go ahead, John.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Janvi. Hello, Thomas. Good to speak with you again. A couple of questions, actually. The first is a reminder. This was a bacterium, but it was Legionella, and I'm thinking about Legionnaire's disease in the Bellevue Stratford in 1976 in Philadelphia. And that had a great deal, of course, of change that occurred as a consequence with ventilation systems, which was also, I think, the basis of Bombay Fever, the book that came out recently, the novel. And is that something that was in place for the Metropole? I'm curious, as far as bacteria were concerned, and is it because this was viral in some sense that really got around the mix? I'm curious about that. Should I ask my second question right now or wait for that?
Why don't you ask both?
The second is about this whole conspiracy theory. And in some senses, the question gets begged precisely because of the secrecy that the Chinese government made manifest with SARS-1, if you will. And so in this particular case, if there was, if China stood to lose so much in that particular episode, is the level of secrecy now, including not making things particularly easy for the global team coming in, only going to continue to fuel such theories, with or without Trump, that is, but nonetheless keeping that in mind? And with regard to that, how have numbers remained quite so low in general in China, the center of radiation, if that indeed is the case? Thank you.
John, I'm going to deal with one very quickly, and that is I don't know the answer. Whether, what kind of post-Legionnaire's disease, what kind of ventilation systems they had, what kind of things they had in the water supply as well. I don't really know. But your second question is fascinating, and which really deals with secrecy and suspicion, right? And the origins of SARS-CoV-2. There are two schools of thought. Very few people are actually agnostic on this. Those who believe that China is defined by secrecy, authoritarianism, and that they will cut corners to get their way, are naturally very suspicious. Those who have actually worked and collaborated with Chinese scientists, and it's important to note, and here's one of the big changes between 2003 and 2020. China has now fully integrated, in fact, to a far greater extent than India is, into the global knowledge-generating networks in terms of biological and in every sort of sphere of activity. And so at the Wuhan Virological Institute, the staff there, the head of it, Xi Zhengli, she's not the head, she's the head of the coronavirus. She got a PhD from France. She is really integrated with the global network of fellow scientists. I mean, the two other big institutes that study coronaviruses are in Texas and in North or South Carolina in the US, right? And plus there are other smaller places, but she is an important part. I mean, she is part of this professional network. They talk to each other, they work with each other, they collaborate with each other in the same way that scientists in any two countries would do. Similarly, the people working at the Wuhan Virological Institute, many of them, and these have done their PhDs, their postdocs in the US and other leading centers of learning. So the point I'm trying to make is that China is not some isolated island that plays by its own rules. It is highly integrated into global scientific and global knowledge production networks. And the reason they are because they are at the leading edge of many of these, of many technologies now, including coronaviruses, for example, something that started. So, we will never know the answer to this. Those who say there is a conspiracy have never really given, nobody has got scientific evidence either way. The evidence, the conspiracy theory evidence is not really scientific evidence. This is evidence from an intelligence agency somewhere which heard that 3 people had fallen ill at the Wuhan Virological Institute in November, and maybe these were early carriers of this disease, in which case maybe it was already in the lab, maybe there was a lab leak. But there is no scientific evidence so far to back this up. On the other side, you have evidence of viruses passing from animals to men through wet markets throughout human history, right? So you've got 2 ways of looking at this, really. And the question then is, each person at the end of the day decides which is more likely. The bulk of the scientific community in the West are convinced that this is basically of natural origin, right? There are others who tend to be a few virologists, but they tend to be non-virologists, though scientists in different disciplines and so on, who are convinced that there is something fishy going on. Neither side has got any convincing evidence. I don't think anybody will get any evidence either way, because it's going to take a long time. If suppose this was assuming it is some natural origin, you need to be able to sample millions and millions of bats, first of all, to find a virus that is closer. The closest one is about 98% similar, 96, 98% similar to SARS, which is a huge distance in evolutionary terms. You need to find something closer. You need to find this perhaps circulating in other animal markets in other parts of China. Now, some of these studies are going on, and even the WHO team, that this was just a first report, and there's a whole list of other studies that they're doing, including serological studies, looking at older samples of blood in blood banks in Wuhan, for example, right? Going back in November, October, September 2019, looking at these stored samples of blood to see whether there is any evidence of this virus before November 2019 or October 2019. So there's a whole bunch of things going on. And I don't think anyone will know the answer, but as far as the rest of the world was concerned, the important thing was that the world got more than adequate notice in a way that it did not in 2003. What happened in 2003 was criminal negligence on the Chinese government part. What happened now was really negligence on other government parts, because everything, they could see what was going on. They could see how terrible this was. They could see the Wuhan government, the Chinese government building these makeshift overnight hospitals because the hospital system was overwhelmed, right? They could see the extent of the lockdown. So they knew how bad this was. Everybody knew from January onwards. Number 2, why are cases, or your third question was why are cases so low? Because this is one of the lessons learned both from China and Hong Kong and so on. China followed a process of eliminating. They tracked every case of this virus. They isolated, they hunted for people with this disease because they didn't want to. So you had mass testing, everybody was tested so that, anyone who was positive was immediately isolated. You had very, very good contact tracing. And the fact that there are very few cases in China, you can believe. I mean, you just need to visit any of these cities. I mean, there's normal life going on, right? In a way that you don't find in many other countries in the world. these are cities that are open for business. You can even do webcams of prominent cities, shopping centers you have these live cams of, shopping streets in Beijing and so on. You can see the crowds there, or in Wuhan, for example, which wouldn't be happening if you had people sort of falling ill. So that's really for the, in terms of the figure. So.
Thank you so much, Thomas.
That was in fact, I think that's probably the best sort of clarity that I've heard in the last few weeks on the lab leak question, because while one can sort of rule out that this is a synthetic virus of any kind, the fact that a sample in a lab might have leaked is something that is being considered seriously. But how does one approach that and approach that sensibly? And I think this is something my colleagues and I have been saying, although I do not work in the history of medicine, I do not work on SARS and COVID, but we were a bunch of historians of India and China who worked together for about 4 years. Mm-hmm. We also met so we traveled, it was like a global collaboration over 4 years. We met once a year. The first year just went, the first meeting just went in talking to each other about, so why is that important in Chinese history? Why is that important in Indian history? Oh, that's why that year, that's why you always seem to be worried about that question. So, we started from that, and in the end, we ended up writing collaborative papers, so neither of us was an expert in the other context. So like I wrote a paper, for example, together with a colleague on India's and China's first science plans, which are rarely sort of talked about juxtaposed. So what we did was juxtapositions and comparison, but all of this background to bring a simple point to the table, which is that we found that even at times where, geopolitically China claimed great isolation, just like the Soviet Union claimed, the Iron Curtain, etc. The scientific community has been incredibly international, starting, it has always been, but nations are a late 19th century creation. Throughout the 20th century, we have seen that communities identify with each other far more sort of, professionally than in other ways. And a lot is at stake when they decide not to identify with each other, right? Like when the Germans tried it when some Germans tried it during the Third Reich with Deutsche Physik, and calling theoretical physics or theoretical sciences as sort of Jewish sciences. And similarly in the Soviet Union at some point, where people like Lysenko could rise to power, and others suffered for it. But these are seen as aberrations even by the scientific community, right? Like where the general sort of the exchanges, the meetings, the conferences, the struggle in India for a different reason, because journals just didn't reach in time for people to read. But in the rest of the world, and therefore also in China, to talk to each other, to find out what's happening, has been incredibly strong. And so in the volume that we put together, we've seen how even the Indians and the Chinese, starting in the late 40s, because they were in a sense reborn as new, in a new political form, as countries, as nation states, were looking to each other, were talking to each other, right? And I think that is something we, it's a good point that you're making, and I think it's a point that needs to be made more often than it is, because it's one forgets when debates are framed geopolitically, one forgets the reality on the ground, and that is one of exchange, one of conversation that has been found historically. So I'm really happy for that answer from you. Is there any other question that our colleagues want to ask, or should we, given that there's very little time left between now and the tutorial, maybe we should let Thomas take a small break before we reassemble for the tutorial. So thank you. This was interesting also because it in a way reinforced for those of us who came from the exhibit to the lecture, and likewise to and otherwise to understand. Now I think I probably shouldn't say it on camera, but I'm going to read your book now. So the recording of this lecture, as well as our other lectures, are available on our YouTube channel. So those of you who want to share it with your friends, please do go ahead, and also look up the other 22 lectures in this public lecture series, because collectively they also give you yet another perspective on what transmission looks like, and how people from across disciplines understand it. What is it that they, in a sense, parse out when they want to talk about transmission? So please do look at our YouTube channel for the public lecture series, which is, as I said, 23 lectures supported by the Indian National Science Academy. Of course, as we already said, right after Thomas's lecture, do look at the cluster of 17 cases, not only because it speaks so well to what Thomas had to tell us today, but also because it will be gone after June 13. It's going to the Cooper and Hewitt Museum in New York, and so we will have to say bye-bye to it. All the other exhibits stay with us until the end of the year, so you can, of course, come back and look at the others again. Like Madhu said, do look at the listen watch section also. There are resources there which will allow you to deepen your understanding of whatever it is that excites you and interests you. We have a lecture coming up by Sabrina Scholz, who is the curator who worked on the Smithsonian exhibition called Outbreak. She's going to tell us, among other things, about what it takes to put a public engagement program around pandemics, what public health messaging looks like when it's conducted through cultural institutions and not through a public health initiative or a government directive. So not from the CDC, not from the WHO, but from the Smithsonian, which is a cultural institution, and what it takes to do that. And, she has interesting stories about how Anthony Fauci, among others, and this is, remember, this is well before the current pandemic, flew down several times to Washington, DC, to ensure that the content of the exhibition was as accurate and reliable as it could be. So do come and listen to her talk about what it took to make an exhibition like the Outbreak. Do give us your feedback, because that's what keeps us on track, as I like to say. Register for our intensive programs coming up. It's the last week, and after June 13, the exhibition enters a different phase of monthly programming, and we'll be back with more news on that next week. Do visit the exhibition website. Thank you incredibly much for taking the time on a Sunday evening to be with us and to listen to Thomas. I'm sure those who haven't been with us today will regret this for not having had the opportunity to ask good questions to Thomas, who has generously answered the ones that we could ask him. Thank you again, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.